Okay, everyone, welcome to PsiAN and our very first Forum Live event. We're so delighted to welcome our esteemed panelists, experts all, and to welcome all of you, our audience and PsiAN membership. I'm Linda Michaels, co-chair of Psychotherapy Action Network, and our two other co-chairs, Janice Muir and Nancy Burke, are also in the audience today. I'd just like to say a few words about PsiAN and then turn it over to Bevin Campbell, our moderator for today. Regarding PsiAN, there are some new faces, so again, just a few words. Our little commercial here. PsiAN's a grassroots nonprofit focused on advocating for therapies of depth, insight, and relationship, and trying to change the public narrative about therapy and make more room for the healing and growth that we have to offer. Most of us, but not all, are therapists, and we're open to all disciplines: psychology, counseling, psychiatry, social work, marriage and family, and all theoretical orientations. We're 4.5 years old, and we've grown quickly to include almost 3,500 individual members and 80 organizational members. Our membership is free, and that makes it easy for all of you to spread the word, and thanks so much for letting your colleagues and organizations know. We have a powerhouse list of advisors and initiatives focused on insurance, policy, training, working with kids and families, and of course, the general public. We're 100% volunteer powered, and everything we do is done during our spare time pro bono. We're so pleased to offer this program to you today free of charge. We can't do everything for free, however, and so our hardworking donate button is available 24/7 on our website. Every dollar goes straight to advocating for therapies of depth, insight, and relationship. Regarding the Forum Live, we launched our forum last year under the advisorship of Todd Essig, who's actually here tonight as our panelist, and we feature written articles by our members under the editorship of Stephen Reedboard. So please, we welcome you to submit articles if you're interested, and poems and photos are also welcome. This is our first Forum Live event where we bring together experts, our panelists, and you to discuss and contemplate key issues and concerns. This event could not be possible without the help and enthusiasm of Becca Butler, a member of the PsiAN communications team. Becca is in her 3rd year working towards a PsyD at Antioch. She joined PsiAN because the more clinical experience she gains, the more she understands the importance of relational and deep therapeutic relationships in the therapy room. She recently moved to Boston to intern at a clinic working with at-risk youth of color, and she knows the importance of a social justice perspective. Becca definitely got the memo early that therapies of depth, insight, and relationship are worth studying and promoting. And so everything that's going on with the technology and behind the scenes today, thanks, Becca. And oh, did I mention that she actually literally moved today? This is true PsiAN dedication. Thank you so much. And now I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Bevin Campbell, a longtime PsiAN member and very active volunteer. Bevin is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Brooklyn, where she sees adult individuals and couples. She's an adjunct clinical supervisor in the doctoral programs at Long Island University and Pace University. Dr. Campbell is a member of the PsiAN communications team and co-editor and co-host of the PsiAN Speaks video series. You can find Bevin's video interviews on the PsiAN Forum as well. Please check them out. They are wonderful, in-depth discussions with many of our advisors. They're just fantastic. And now, take it away, Bevin.
Thank you so much, Linda. So as Linda said, I'm Bevin Campbell. I'm going to be moderating this event. And okay, so let me start with this question. So why this panel? For the past 16 months, as with most of our daily life, therapy has gone online. And while some therapists, particularly those working in institutional settings, have continued to see patients in person, for most of us watching today, I'm presuming that a significant portion of your work, or more likely all of it, has taken place by phone or video conference. So now with increasing vaccination rates, the return of in-person work is, if not right here, right now, on a very near horizon. So what will be the place of teletherapy in a world where in-person sessions become possible again? And a related but different question is, what should it be? I am sure I am not the only person who has heard a sentiment from patients or colleagues, or perhaps you have uttered it yourself. I'm not sure I want to go back. This really works for me. There are other people, of course, who are bursting at the seams to get back into the office and see people in person again. In the time of COVID, teletherapy was something that happened to us for the most part. It was not a choice that we made. And now choice is back on the scene. We can recreate and restructure the frame of our clinical work. To some degree, I think the legacy of the pandemic on the field of mental health will be a result of choices we make as individual therapists about what the therapy we conduct will look like from here on out. Since its inception, PsiAN has taken an interest in the intersection of the digital world and mental health, particularly in regards to the rise of text-based therapies, the increasing automation of mental health treatments, and the dangers of therapists becoming subsumed into the gig economy. We put this panel together to orient us to what we need to bear in mind and reflect on and wrestle with as we create a vision for the post-pandemic future of psychotherapy. As Linda said in her intro, at PsiAN, we advocate for therapies of depth, insight, and relationship. And I think one of the most important things we offer in these therapies is the transformative power of our curiosity. So I hope and I think this evening will stimulate all of our curiosity about what this past year has meant and what it'll mean in the future, and that it'll open up space for us to reflect on the historical, cultural, and clinical issues at hand. So let me get to introducing our speakers. And I actually have been pinching myself since they all agreed. I'm not really sure how we pulled this off. We convened a lot of really important voices in the field of teletherapy. I want to suggest, as we listen to their remarks, that we appreciate the plurality of voices represented in the panel. And at the same time, that we do, as we often do in the brand of therapies of depth, insight, and relationship, of which I am most familiar, which is psychoanalysis, that we also listen to and appreciate the voices that are absent and the voices that are not here on this topic. This is the first of many PsiAN Forum live events to come. And over time, we look forward to inviting in more voices and continuing to expand and deepen the conversation. So let me just tell you a little bit about how the evening is going to go. We're going to have remarks from our 4 panelists, followed by a discussion, which I'll be moderating, followed by a Q&A. So at any point in the evening, you can drop a question into the Q&A. We're actually going to invite you to unmute yourselves if your question is chosen. If you don't want to read your question, that's fine. You can just indicate that you would like me to read it, and I will read your question for the panel. And if you would like to direct your question to a particular panelist, you can indicate that as well. Okay, so let me introduce our first panelist. Hannah Zeavin, PhD, is a lecturer in the departments of English and History at the University of California, Berkeley, and is a faculty affiliate of the University of California at Berkeley Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society, and on the Berkeley Center for New Media's Executive Committee. Additionally, she is a visiting fellow at the Columbia University Center for the Study of Social Difference. Zeavin's first book, The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, is forthcoming from MIT Press in August 2021, with a foreword by John Durham Peters. She is at work on her second book, Mother's Little Helpers, Technology in the American Family. That's an amazing title, MIT Press 2023. Zeavin serves as an editorial associate for the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association and a former fellow of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Other work has appeared in or is forthcoming from American Imago, Differences, a Journal of Feminist Cultural Studies, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Real Life Magazine, Slate, Somatosphere, Logic Magazine, and beyond. Zeavin received her BA from Yale University in 2012 and her PhD from the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU in 2018. Please take it away, Hannah.
Thank you so much, and for that extremely nice and I love the idea of a Center for Social Distance, which we can make in the future if Columbia University is willing. I'm just going to put some information and links about myself in the chat. So I don't mean to pick up immediately where Bevin just was, and thank you so much for that grounding introduction to the panel, Bevin, but I'll begin. For a century, when we've thought of therapy, many of us, perhaps first and foremost, have thought about the places where it happens: the clinic, the ward, the institution. Most prominent among these spatial associations may be for us here today, the consulting room and its accoutrement, the box of tissues, a covert clock, perhaps a couch, the waiting room buzzers, a white noise machine humming. Beyond the iconicity of the container itself, the office has also offered patient and therapist alike a reflective space, seemingly apart from their experiences of the rest of the world. The office allowed patient and therapist to meet in a confidential, secure location, and one ostensibly free from the distractions or sounds of work and family, which I can't promise will be the case while I'm speaking. For the last year or so, this de facto and idealized therapeutic place has been unavailable to most mental health care providers and their patients, although of course not all, because of mandated social distancing, which has governed the rest of our lives. Instead, FaceTime and Zoom, but also proprietary medical platforms and corporate apps have become the dominant spaces of therapy. These digital means of meeting were often and remain rife with the permeabilities that have attended pandemic life: always on work, a paucity of childcare, and techno intrusion in the form of glitch and bad signal. Individual therapy has, to the minds of many, gone from a beautifully ritualized sanctum to just another digital input. Before the pandemic, teletherapy was a shadow form of mental health care. It is now the default. But as vaccinations have risen in the United States, although now barring, of course, the Delta variant, therapists and patients are increasingly able to consider where they might want to see each other again. And this is the topic that Bevin and PsiAN have convened us to discuss. For some, vaccination has marked an end and a return, quite literally, to the scenes of and from the before, even just as abruptly. Given the long-handed attachment and import of the therapeutic office, it makes sense then that for many therapists, a life of Zoom sessions was merely tolerable, if it was tolerable at all, during an extreme public health crisis, an exception, however long, rather than a new rule. These therapists argue for a swift and immediate return to the office, and of course, this may be you sitting in the audience nodding, or have already been there with their masks on and windows open, sanitizing between sessions long before they were vaccinated. These clinicians are committed to the idea that a certain kind of therapeutic co-presence can only be achieved by two bodies or more in the same room, and without it, the work suffers deeply. Touch is brought metaphorically into the equation as the sign of embodied proximity. On listservs, as well as in hushed voices at newly enjoyed dinner parties, more than one therapist has invoked safer sex, comparing video therapy to sex with condoms in the negative, as opposed to, of course, in the positive, which it could also convey. Remote therapy becomes a barrier, even as it has diminished other blocks to treatment. And indeed, because much of psychotherapy's history, although again, not all, has been conducted in person, the very metaphorization and theorization, our dear and cherished language for therapeutic work, relies on physicality, terms and concepts like holding, containing, enveloping, as well as their inverse like dropping, are central to how many clinicians envision their work. For other practitioners, COVID-19 broke these default settings and gave us new ones, exposing their optionality. Being freed from a commute, expensive rents, and the monotony of seated listening was, well, liberating. Now they argue there's no going back, or at least not full-time anyway, and that can be reconfigured. Some term this as a kind of laziness or selfishness on part of the patient, as a self-appellation. They claim this for themselves, favoring the working life of the therapist over other concerns. And perhaps more importantly, other clinicians who might previously have assumed that the phone or Zoom might thin out, if not ruin, the intimate connection to the patient have discovered that, in fact, not only does teletherapy work well enough for them, but they prefer it for many specific patients as a clinical tool. For those mental health clinicians who rely on interpretation as methods, such as psychoanalysts, psychodynamic therapists, how to interpret a patient's unwillingness to come in person is going to be a new challenge. Is it resistance, or is it safety seeking, or is it a material necessity? This is going to expose a new turn or return to an old turn in therapy, where power to set the frame of the therapeutic scenario is more equitably held between patient and therapist. Where to practice is no longer a therapist's choice alone. Even if a clinician moves back into the office, patients must be willing to join them there. And in the reverse as well, if a therapist wants to stay remote, patients must be willing to join them there. Teletherapy can be, not always, more accessible and add variation to this otherwise punishingly one-fits-all experience of office-bound care. This has been a revelation for many, especially those marginalized and pathologized in and by these modes of care, whether now or in the recent or longer past. A patient can choose not to be seen or be seen partially. They can show their actual space of living or not, can meet with a practitioner much further away than they could ever travel to regularly, and patients don't have to commute, which means that therapy conversely costs less because it's fewer minutes away from work or other care duties. One risk then of debating teletherapy as just good or bad, whether it's acceptable, better, worse, as intimate, more intimate, or less, is that it can be a simplified conversation. Not that it's not an important one, but that it risks becoming simplified because it can further class presence, embodiment, and distance, and at its core, access to mental health care only for those already able to purchase this care. And some have heralded this new pervasive turn to therapy as that which will, once and for all, solve the problem of access to care writ large. And this claim is also not new. Along its history, as well as in the contemporary, teletherapy, like many in digital interventions or disruptions, has been escorted by a democratizing promise that by harnessing various techno-cures, we will somehow magically have therapy for all, as if the digital just obliterates everything material in the way of an equitable distribution of care, as if it were not systematically and violently uneven in the dispositions of the present. Telemental health care not only remediates the medical redlining of therapy, but is additionally digitally redlined. We don't just all magically have access to the internet. Corporate teletherapy apps are frequently evangelized as increasing access, but are, after all, corporate and interested in their bottom line, and are actually, in general, no more affordable for being tele. Additionally, they come with a whole host of labor, data privacy, and therapeutic confidentiality problems that affect patient and therapist alike, as our host, PsiAN, and my co-panelist, Todd Essig, has brilliantly shown again and again. This can exacerbate wider problems of economic inequality and structural precarity, which will shape access to therapy and mental health care more generally, as well as the labor that secures it. And we have to be very cautious there. With the sudden move to teletherapy, we risk remediating these deeper entrenched problems, but at scale. And yet, mental health care is so easily enfolded into a Silicon Valley model of move fast and break things, in part because there are so few affordances health insurance plans make for therapy in private practice. Again, thank you, PsiAN, and too few practitioners to go around. In short, mental health care is already so broken that almost anything can be articulated as a solution. Yet in a pandemic deeply exacerbated by medical racism, the switch to teletherapy opens some, but certainly not all, barriers to psychological care. This is perhaps most true for historically underserved and ignored communities where purchasing care has been exceedingly difficult. In a nation where insurance is tied to work, and its system of reimbursement for in-network and out-of-network mental health care providers is sheerly exhausting to learn and to deal with, suddenly 4 out of 5 big insurance companies waived the copay for teletherapy in March of last year. Many new patients were suddenly able to come into therapy and access this form of care for material ones because simply it had been shifted to remote. But that is not a question of technology. That's a question of insurance. And anyway, it turns out there weren't enough. Apparently only 5% of new patients were seen during the pandemic. There was only a 5% growth, even though often it's articulated as exceeding that. When we reduce the clinical debate around teletherapy to questions of its goodness or flatness, the debate, however falsely again, is going to center on a choice and a resulting clash between those clinicians who are eagerly anticipating safe, close contact with patients in the quiet room they rely on, and those who have adapted and are loath to let go of this new digital way of convening intimacy. And of course, for these practitioners, the stakes are about as huge as they come. The question is, what constitutes good care in the 21st century? Therapists are faced right now with how to safeguard the legacy of clinical practice, either by preserving or shifting it, and this solemn question of care which attends it. Yet along these arguments is also a desire for continuity, born out of a notion that this is how therapy has always been done. We've met in person. Gathering in the office is a long-standing custom. Psychoanalysts joke about the impossibility of imagining Freud's Zoom room, for instance. But this is actually only a partial view of therapy's history. Ever since practitioners of the so-called talking cure stopped laying hands on patients as part of hypnosis, some intervening distance has always been present and has been a deeply important part of regulating therapeutic intimacy. Teletherapy is as old as psychoanalysis itself, and Freud himself practiced a version of it through letter writing. Teletherapy may feel obtrusively here right now, but telecare has been with us along the 20th century and long before teletherapy apps came to dominate the conversation. So just to conclude, too frequently, this means that when we talk about the paucity of care available, we are always talking about access, affordability, and the availability of mental health care workers. So in a way, we can reprise the terrain of Freud's famous speech, Lines of Advance of Psychoanalysis, where Freud argued for psychoanalysis for all in the aftermath of World War I, and of course at the start of the Spanish influenza, even if it meant giving up some of the cherished assumptions about what analytic practice might look like in its schedule, location, modality, and fee. Freud, tellingly, by way of a metaphor of precious metal, argued for quote unquote psychotherapy of the people. And he said, quote, "We shall then be faced with the task of adapting our technique to the new conditions. It is very probable too that the large scale application of our therapy will compel us to alloy the pure gold of analysis freely with the copper of direct suggestion." Freely here, it turns out, is key. Teletherapy too, across its much longer history, has almost always been offered for free or low fee by activists, practitioners, community members, and experimenting psychologists. They have alloyed the gold, the pure gold of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, as I argue in my forthcoming book, The Distance Cure, with silicon or telephone wire or radio signal. This has expanded the reach of the therapeutic office by dissolving it, not just because it increases that scene's material reach over distance, but because once one assumption about what therapy must look like goes out the proverbial window, so do other assumptions about where and when and for whom therapy can be made available. So if therapy is not constrained by the office, perhaps, it may follow that we can both as individuals, but maybe more importantly, systemically, think about how we want to insist on treatment in this fallen world. Because perhaps when we insist on in-person treatment, we're insisting on a kind of purity of genre, of payment, and ultimately, as Freud knew, the kind of patient who will see. And this, of course, is not to say that all teletherapy is created equal, that all silicon is the right alloy that will safely extend therapy's reach, if it even extends it at all. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Hannah. That was really terrific. I just wrote on my notes, pre-order Hannah's book. So our next speaker is Todd Essig. Todd Essig, PhD, is a training and supervising psychoanalyst at the William Alanson White Institute and a member of PsiAN's advisory board. Widely known as a pioneer in the innovative uses of mental health technology, he publishes and lectures widely. He has served on the editorial boards for Contemporary Psychoanalysis and JAPA, and recently co-edited with Gillian Isaac Russell's a special issue of Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Psychoanalysis and Technology. In the aftermath of 9/11, he was board chair for the New York Disaster Counseling Coalition, providing free mental health care to first responders and their families. Since March 2020, he has been co-chair of the American Psychoanalytic Association's COVID-19 advisory team and has been awarded Distinguished Service Award by the American Psychoanalytic Association and the New York State Psychological Association for his efforts. He wrote Managing Mental Wealth for Forbes, where he covered the intersection of technology, psychology, and culture. His practice is in New York City, where he treats individuals and couples, almost all of whom used to come to his office. Thanks. Take it away, Todd.
Thanks, Bevin. Okay. Thanks to PsiAN for inviting me for this. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm really delighted to have a place on this panel with the other panelists who I'm really interested in hearing from and talking with. So, what comes next for us? Well, I believe the post-pandemic future for psychotherapies of depth, insight, and relationship depends on us and our capacity for nuance. It's not going to be clear. Will we be able to appreciate both the possibilities and the limitations of teletherapies? It's not either or. Can we both build on the convenience and efficacy of teletherapies and simultaneously protect what is only possible with the rich, risky experiences of in-person work? How do we avoid the trap of either overvaluing or undervaluing pandemic-specific teletherapy experiences, both of which are quite prevalent in when I hear colleagues talk about what the last year and a half has been like? The risk we face is a future of artificial intimacy, the other AI. And what tools do we have to fight for nuance? My thinking, perhaps my hope, is that focusing on differences will make all the difference as we come out of the COVID crisis. Because don't forget, the future really is ours to create, and one should never, ever let a good crisis go to waste. So, I'm going to mention 3 differences to frame my participation in this conversation. First, not everything that is psychotherapeutic should be called psychotherapy. Just because something helps people feel less anxious or depressed, more hopeful, or even more self-aware, all wonderful outcomes, does not make it psychotherapy. Just like, for example, not everything that increases heart health should be called cardiology. Yoga and mindfulness practices are terrific. Expressive writing helps some, but they're not psychotherapy. Always available text exchanges with chatbots, or even clinicians following a script and chasing retention rates can help. But they should be called interactive self-help, like a book one can take off the shelf at any time, and not psychotherapy, despite the millions spent on marketing. Let's save the term psychotherapy for those practices where there is someone professionally and fully accountable for the possibility of harm. Note, this results in limiting it to practices that are research-based and limited by professional ethics, including genuine informed consent and a prohibition against dual relationships, thereby excluding text therapies and platform-constrained practices. Second difference that can make a difference is that not all psychotherapies are psychotherapies of depth, insight, and relationship. There is a split in the field, a veritable war for the future of— between those of us who believe an I-thou relationship is an absolutely necessary feature for something to be psychotherapy. And those who view psychotherapy as a device-independent delivery of an algorithm for a predefined problem. In other words, an I-it relationship. Insurance companies, technopreneurs, cultural scientism, non-practicing clinical academic researchers, and professional organizations with profound physician envy are all lined up on the side of the algorithm warriors. Unfortunately, those of us ignoring differences between screen relations and in-person treatment, between teletherapies and in-the-office work, are also unintentionally giving aid and comfort to the algorithm warriors. Plus, the algorithm warriors are deploying a dangerous Trojan horse under a banner of accessibility, namely things like PsiPact or a national license. The third difference that will make a difference is loss, awareness of loss. In the emerging new beginning, loss will be unavoidable. Too many lost a family member, friend, or neighbor to the virus and how it was initially mishandled. Everyone lost a year and a half of life as we knew it. Everyone is starting now to lose the positive pandemic experiences we had, like trading time with family for the familiar frustrations of commuting, or the lost convenience that comes with returning to in-person treatment. And that brings us to teletherapy specifically, the inherent losses of screens and speakers, and what to do about them. As a profession or collection of professions, we need to be clear that working in person affords opportunities just not present on screen or speaker. In-person experience affords possibilities for the risks of shared embodiment and a correspondingly deeper experience of trust not present on screen or with speakers. Relationship experiences via screen or speaker are paler and therefore less memorable. They rely on fundamentally different processes than being in person, especially when it comes to such clinically relevant processes as attention, privacy, consistency, reverie, empathy, affect attunement, bodily processes, and the range of possible enactments. Plus, there are experiences that only happen with screen relations, like technology's intrusion and the too often ignored experience, borrowing from Winnicott, of being alone in the absence of the other. When it comes to clinically managing these losses, which is the challenge we have had and will have going forward, a good place to start is one art by the poet Elizabeth Bishop. It famously begins, "The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster." The poem then continues with mounting tension of loss, from the mundane to the far-reaching to the devastating, to conclude that managing loss, our challenge, is a challenge of creativity. "I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster." And writing the losses of teletherapy, I believe is crucial for making teletherapy work. Special attention to creatively mastering the losses of teletherapy was central when it was forced upon us during the pandemic, and it will be central going forward when it becomes a choice. Teletherapy of depth, insight, and relationship depends on telepresence. And telepresence is the empty page where we must write it and master the art of losing. It is the paradox of, on one side, being simultaneously entrapped by the illusion of non-mediation, of telepresence, of feeling fully present with someone in their absence. And on the other side, observing and even commenting on the limitations and losses that inevitably come from being in the presence of each other's absence. It is a specifically 21st century version of Sullivan's participant observation, or of the recently deceased Sheldon Bach's observations about the uniquely human capacity to both experience and observe simultaneously. And while that paradox may look like disaster, holding both in mind makes it possible to master the art of losing and find the nuanced both and solutions our future requires. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd. I'm having so many thoughts. I'm going to hold on to them and introduce our next speaker. We're very happy to have Leora Trub, PhD, joining us. Leora is an associate professor of psychology in the School Clinical Child PsyD program at Pace University, where she is involved in clinical training of doctoral candidates. She also runs the Digital Media and Psychology Lab, which explores how technologies affect our conceptions of ourselves, our relationships with others, as well as the underlying psychological and emotional needs they meet. Recent projects include a qualitative study of the perspectives and experiences of psychoanalytic clinicians on the impact of technology on psychotherapy practice, and the development of an app aimed at increasing mindfulness during text-based interactions. She's a practicing psychologist based in New York City who works with adolescents, adults, and couples. Thanks for joining us, Leora.
Thank you, Bevin. All right. So thinking about the future of telehealth sends me back to the past, which I suppose is something of a psychoanalytic occupational hazard. I think about the origins of my interest in the intersection between technology and psychotherapy. It was 2005. I was a blissfully Luddite psychology student without a smartphone, but I had a patient who was deeply engaged with a fully online community on a platform that would today fall under the umbrella of social media, a term that I'd not yet heard. While in therapy, she was able to take interpersonal risks with people online that she couldn't do in person. It was really my first insight into how profound technology would come to be in mediating people's lives, relationships, their very identity. The way that this experience some listened to my patients when they talked about their technology. Sitting with a 17-year-old, we discussed an interaction from the night before with an interaction from the night before with a guy that she was hooking up with. He had texted at 11 p.m. Hey, how did you respond? I asked. Well, I waited 6 minutes, she said. Responding to my quizzical look, she quickly explained that 6 minutes is required in order to prevent seeming too eager. Of course. And then I asked, I texted back, hey. I thought for a moment and I asked her, well, what did you do in those 6 minutes? I waited, she said, an obvious answer to a silly question. And I found myself thinking about that. 6 minutes is a long time to do good therapeutic work. So I did what anyone would do. I developed an app based on this very question. Using material from my clinical interactions with adolescents and young adults, the app offers a guided audio reflection aimed at increasing people's awareness of their thoughts, feelings, and intentions before hitting send on a message. The reflective practice asks them to visualize the intended recipient of the message, to really imagine the person opening the phone, to see the expression on their face, their body language. Essentially, this app represents an attempt at using technology to offer an experience that cultivates the very qualities that technology tends to inhibit in people: awareness of self and other, reflective functioning, and intimacy, and impulse control. After going through the reflective practice, people's messages, which I had access to, tend to be more honest, more self-aware, more compassionate. One person changed, "Why did you not show up? You are a fool," to "Why did you not show up? I'm disappointed." Another changed, "I do not want to deal with you anymore. You are toxic," to "I feel our relationship is suffering and I feel a need to disconnect. Let's talk about it." These data were and are still powerful. Something was happening for these people when using the app, but I never thought about it as therapy. I still don't. And yet I also recognize that in not thinking about how it was like therapy in any way, I was avoiding a larger question about what this app signified about the direction we were headed in. I didn't want to think about that because of the other hat I wear. Similar to many psychoanalytically and depth-oriented clinicians that I imagine are in this audience, I've always placed a on the embodied encounter. The codification and automation of therapy through apps like Talks are a threat to me. I don't want to think that what I do might be replaced by an on-demand text-based test, much less by a bot programmed to give automated responses to someone talking about their feelings of sadness or loneliness. But I can see the power that a mindfulness app, or dare I say a therapy app, can offer. Many of our patients, or dare I say consumers, will be curious about how technology can enhance their therapy and their mental health. And when done thoughtfully, perhaps they can. Like many of us, I have long consoled myself that what we are offering is unique, that people will continue to recognize and feel the importance of coming to an office, turning off their device, and attempting to stay present for themselves for a full 50 uninterrupted minutes. I pushed away my fears of our field becoming obsolete, especially if we don't reckon seriously with the ways that times have changed. But times are always changing, and there's always a need to adapt. And I didn't know that Hannah was also going to talk about this, so I'll just very briefly mention it. But in 1918, Freud gave an address in which he acknowledged that psychoanalysis, when practiced in the correct fashion, will always be limited by the nature of the fact that it can only reach so many people and that it is reserved for the wealthy. He argues that psychoanalysis must be free and available to everyone, a psychotherapy for the people. This was radical. And in case you didn't get a chance to memorize the quote, he said, "The large-scale application of our therapy will compel us to alloy the pure gold of analysis freely with the copper of direct suggestion. And hypnotic influence too might find a place in it again, as it has in the treatment of war neuroses." So in other words, our theory may be gold, but our technique will have to be modified to reach the people. We may indeed have gold to offer, but what good is the gold that we are offering if there are not enough people, if the people cannot afford it and cannot access it? In qualitative interviews that I conducted with 30 psychoanalysts 5 years ago, pre-pandemic, many of them spoke about remote sessions in somewhat negative terms. They felt less comfortable in their bodies and more self-conscious, especially due to their own image next to that of the patient. They described talking more and engaging in fewer or shorter silences than when in person. At times, they were more easily distracted, sometimes by the technology itself, a notification perhaps. During silences or a pause, they and their patients would sometimes become anxious about the loss or interruption of the digital connection, unsure if the patient was frozen due to a technological blip or due to deep sadness. This was not an atmosphere conducive to regressed states. Well, a pandemic later, and such experiences are the new normal. So normal, in fact, that we may forget to think about them as we have the choice of returning to the office. As I talk with my patients about returning to the office, I am struggling alongside them to reconcile the convenience we have both come to enjoy with the distant memory and my own theoretical position regarding the importance of being bodies together while we do this work. And so, in the footsteps of Freud's radical words, I'd like to leave us with a few questions, and I really look forward to hearing yours as well. How has our work been redefined during the pandemic? And if you think it has not, might there be some function being served to see things as having stayed the same? What anxieties are we sitting with as we attempt to return to normal? Before the pandemic, some of us held on to the notion that what set us apart from many of our newer competitors was rooted in the value that we placed on being bodies together, on being in person. But now we have no choice but to contend with the fact that at long last, depth-oriented psychotherapy is like any other field in a pandemic, that enough of what we do can transfer online, which is important because it keeps us in business. That cat's out of the bag. And so, in an increasingly competitive landscape, can we acknowledge our commercial anxieties, make space for them, and then also look beyond them to make room for the reality that we are always, indeed we must always, be thinking about how to adapt to the changing times and the changing needs of the people we aim to serve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leora. Something I didn't mention about Leora in her bio is, I've known her since we were interns, and this whole time she's been studying social media. No one's ever convinced her to make a single social media profile. So it's kind of an interesting thing about her. Next, we are going to be hearing from Jill Bellinson. And we knew when we put this panel together that we really wanted someone to speak about teletherapy in children. And we're really thrilled that she agreed to do so. So Jill Bellinson, PhD, teaches and supervises in the postgraduate programs of the William Alanson White Institute, where she was one of the founders of the Child Training Program and several other psychoanalytic institutes. She supervises in the clinical psychology doctoral programs of CUNY, Columbia, and Yeshiva universities. Dr. Bellinson consults at New Alternatives for Children, a child welfare agency, and A Home Within, a treatment program for people with a history of foster care. She's the author of Children's Use of Board Games and Psychotherapy and numerous papers on psychodynamic thought and technique, and a co-editor of The Importance of Play in Early Childhood Education. Dr. Bellinson is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst in private practice in Manhattan, working with children and adults. Dr. Bellinson has been working remotely with children since March 2020 and teaching workshops to help other child therapists convert to remote work. Okay, thank you. Jill, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bevin, for that introduction. Thank you, PsiAN, for inviting me to be part of this panel of such distinguished speakers. I'm really delighted to be here. And particularly since so few of the panels over the last year when we've talked about working in telehealth have included child therapists. Most of the conversations are about how we convert in-depth talk therapy to online talk therapy, and it's a very different ballgame for children. As Bevin said, I've been teaching child therapists how to do this online for the year, and working hard to get all of us to be able to translate what we do in person to what we do online. And I'm here today to say we actually can't, or at least I think we shouldn't. There are people who will disagree with that. Jack and Carrie Kelly Novak gave up their physical office several years before the pandemic and haven't worked in person, but they do work with children. PsiAN actually published a paper by Carolyn Sehan about working successfully with children in telehealth and remote work. If you surf online for play therapy, online play therapy, you will come up with a lot of sources for behavioral therapy, stress reduction, parent counseling, in-depth, insight-oriented, relationship-oriented treatment, and rarely anything for anyone under 13, never under 8. But I see children as young as 3 in my office, which you're actually seeing in the background. This is my virtual background of my office. I'm not in it, but I can look at it from here. This is where we used to meet. A main reason why it can't translate really is that kids don't talk. The language in which kids experience their world and process their experiences is not words. They respond, they experience action, they behave, they work in the metaphor of play, and all of their experiences are felt in that way and communicated in that way and ameliorated their difficulties through the metaphor of play and behavior. So in my office, there's no dollhouse picture. We have a dollhouse where children can play out the family dramas that happen in their world. And my character can come into the dollhouse, and I can be alternate self states. I can. You can't even see this online, can you? I can provide alternate solutions sometimes, and I can be a foil for aggression and hate and disgust and all the things that need to be expressed toward an other that children need to play out in order to fully experience and work through. In action, while we're doing this, I've got action figures in my office that battle out whatever the power struggles are that children are growing through. And I can be the loser in every single battle, so that children get to feel what it's like to be the winner and the destroyer and the decimator in every battle, and can work with that experience in the office, in the action that we do. We provide food in the office, and we provide elaborate feasts in which we feed each other and join in play together, and sometimes poison each other, which for 3-year-olds is actually poop. But there's a lot of that in the meals that we serve for each other. So there's a lot of very dramatic interaction between us in the office. There's a lot of working through whatever their difficulties or living are through the interaction that we have together. But online, that really can't exist. It's hard, but I'm suggesting that there's something about it that actually can't exist. So here's where I'm actually sitting. This is my online office. This is the little paltry set of toys that I brought with me when I ran out of my office a year ago March, with some of the toys that the children I'd been working with at the time were playing with. And we would have a selection of toys here to play with. It's far less than in the office, and it almost accentuates the distance that when I offer you food and I hold it out to you, I prove to us that you can't take it. You can't knock it out of my hand the way you might in the office. You can't pretend to eat from it. I can't pretend to eat from yours. We really can't share online. Children are sitting alone in a room. If we're lucky, they're sitting alone in the room. If we're not, they're interrupted by parents and siblings and somebody who just wants to get something out of the fridge. And so we can't create a frame. I'm surprised no one else talked about glitches. I wasn't planning to talk about technology glitches because I thought everybody else was going to bring those up to a greater extent. But with children, of course, with all of us, we know that there have been technology glitches, there have been freezes, there have been lost voices. With children, young children certainly, they have to stop, go get a parent, come back in the room, sign back on again, begin the session, and then we have to wait for the parent to leave so we can interact again. So that the glitches for children are another level of challenge. That one's not insurmountable, but it's another level of challenge. Most of us doing child therapy online have talked more than we ever did in person. Older children can talk more. I've been impressed with the middle schoolers can actually do more verbal interaction than they could in the office, which was full of distractions and toys and harder to sit still and talk. They can sit still when they're in the safety of their own home and can interact, but 3-year-olds can't talk. No matter what we do, they can't do that. A lot of us have added structure to the interactive play. We've found online games and drawing, interactive drawing. The whiteboard on Zoom is one of those where we can work together. But the structure of those structured games, as much as it helps us to spend comfortable time together, also keeps us far from insight and depth because of the structure. In my office, if a character dies, the ambulance comes, the cars behind the ambulance make a lot of noise because they're so angry that they're held up while the ambulance gets by. The ambulance takes the body to the hospital, the surgeons come out, the worried parents come in. We have a whole elaborate scenario that can grow out of that. In Roblox, if a character dies, they spawn and play the next round. You can't create all of those scenarios in almost any online platform with the creativity and the expressiveness that you can do in line. And young children need that ability to create and express through the play. So it's not enough. We can't speak to the child in front of us if we're talking And we lose that interactive ability to be together in the same place and play dramatically together. But of course, we've made do, like everyone's talking about. We've made do over the course of the year quite a bit. And recognizing the successes that we've had, as well as the difficulties that we've had. A supervisee of mine came in this week. They're so good when they bring examples when I need an example. Supervisee came in and presented a 5-year-old girl that she has been seeing for about 6 or 8 months now, but only met online. They've never seen each other in person. And they had a very good relationship. They had a strong connection. They've had a lot of successes in helping the child calm down and be more focused. And they met for the first time in person last week. And the child came into the office, looked around, closed the door, and started playing out aggressive themes that she never felt safe enough to play when she was at home with a parent right outside the door. So it's so clear to me that there's so much missing and unavailable to us when we have to see someone not in the same room and in an environment where we don't know where they are or what the parameters are for them, and have no ability to create the frame ourselves. Only they create the frame. We have to follow whatever they create for themselves. That said, I'm talking from New York City, where just yesterday the emergency was lifted, the state of emergency was lifted. We are only now beginning to be permitted to be back in person to full capacity. CDC is still recommending that anyone without vaccines who's not vaccinated has to wear masks and stay socially distant. Children are not vaccinated and are not even close to that. Many office suites have decided only vaccinated people can come into the suite, so that means all children are out. No children can be seen in person right now. As some people have mentioned, being in person, people do have to wear masks. There's a trade-off in wearing a mask and seeing each other, but only partially, or seeing full expressiveness, even if it's from a distance and with the delays that online provides for us. And kids are messy super spreaders. Kids eat and drop crumbs all over from their mouths, from their every orifice. They get colds. Any child therapist that works with kids knows that in the winter we're going to have lots and lots of colds, because they're going to have lots and lots of colds. They're going to come into the office sort of dripping. Their colds are always very wet. They a cold and then reach out to touch a toy with this hand that just wiped their nose with it. And right now, while the disease that they might spread could be deadly to someone in their family or the family of someone else I see, it's clearly not time, I think, to go back to in-person. I'm really glad that there have been options over this past year to be able to provide for people who have been so stressed by life and by pandemic-induced stresses. I'm so privileged to have been able to be there for people who needed to speak and play and work over the last year. And I'm so grateful that we created options for being able to do this online. And I hope that we get to the other side of this soon. And when we do, that we are able to recognize the distinctions between online work and in-person work, so that we can really make the best choices we can for all of the people who are coming to see us and what they most need from us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was really great. I was like, why am I getting so stressed out listening to Jill? And I realized I was having flashbacks to facilitating my child's Zoom preschool sessions a year ago. Okay. I would like to start, just jump right in and ask some questions of the panel. And I just want to remind, the participants, please drop any questions into the Q&A, again, directed to any panelist if you like, or if you'd like the whole panel to, speak to it. So I actually want to start with something, Todd, that you did not say tonight, but you said a while ago. So I was listening to a talk recently you gave early on in the pandemic for the American Psychoanalytic Association. And one of the things you kind of raised sort of raises a potential issue was, would there be the potential for cognitive dissonance to shape our perception of the acceptability of teletherapy? So in other words, given that we know that attitudes and beliefs tend to shift to match behaviors, might we start to find teletherapy acceptable or even preferable to in-person work simply as a byproduct of conducting treatments this way? So I'm bearing in mind what Hannah has said about the risks of focusing our discussion on a debate about acceptability or preferability, but I'm still curious what the panelists think about this cognitive dissonance. Has it taken place? Is that your sense that that has happened, as a field, in terms of our feelings about teletherapy?
Well, since you quoted me, let me jump in and start with that. And I did kind of try to allude to that when I talked about how people are either undervaluing or overvaluing, and kind of making attitudes change in the direction of what they've been doing. I think that's a very real risk. And I think what we're doing here tonight is the antidote to that, which is engaging in the kind of serious scholarship that can hopefully let us kind of counteract that and make those attitudes be clear. One of the things that, and I realize I'm kind of going a little afield right now, but I really kind of appreciated and was resonating with the way that both Hannah and Leora, using scholarship and research and their own experiences, kind of created this space where the differences that both Jill and I clinically were referring to could kind of really be talked about in a way which essentially gives permission to people whose attitudes are shifting to have whatever attitudes they can come up with, more reflectively, more reflectively, rather than simply as a result of, Leon Festinger's legacy and kind of changing attitudes to fit behavior.
I want to add to that, Todd. The sense I've had that we lived for a year knowing that we had no choice. And we all 100% hated online therapy. And that we now are thinking about options, about whether to go back, how much to go back, who to go back with. And for the first time now, most of us are facing questions that we haven't faced for a year. So I think how that unfolds, how that evolves, is going to be very interesting over the next few months, as we actually have choices about going back, which we haven't had to face before, so we could afford to be negative about it and not have to think about the nuances of it.
And we're facing that new choice with a year and a half of this experience. So it's going to be very difficult, especially with patients, where the questions are going to be coming up about, well, if you're making me go back to the office now, was the last year and a half a waste of time? Or the opposite of that, but I can't wait to go back because the last year and a half has been a waste of time.
Well, that makes me think of something, Hannah, you talked about. So both doing teletherapy and then renegotiating the frame has this kind of democratizing impact on the therapy relationship, right? Like the old way of being where it's my office on my terms, my time frame. We don't even have a discussion about that. That's over. So I am curious about that change in this sort of power structure, the power hierarchy, and if you guys have started to experience that impact, or if you have a prediction of that impact. And I guess I also sort of have a sub question, which is, if I want if I or one wants the old power hierarchy back, is that always problematic or regressive?
I mean, I think I'd love to just jump in and say two things, because it's also, I think there's a difference between this kind of shared notion of, so where shall we meet? That doesn't mean it's necessarily on offer. So that's a kind of idealized way. So if the analyst is going back and the patient does not want to go back, it can be talked about ad infinitum. But if the analyst will not allow the patient to continue remotely, the patient is faced with a choice, right? Which is termination or going back in person. And these kind, the fact of termination, which can also be used as a threat, and then talked about, there are real caveats to that kind of equitable sharing in the space, which is very different than the sort of marketing lie of sort of what many corporate teletherapy apps, which is that they claim, right, that this is a democratizing function just hosted in the digital, when it's not, right? Many of these apps cost the same amount almost per session as in-person or remote therapy with an individual private practitioner. But the sheen on that marketing is very convincing. So there, I think those are, in my remarks, these were two different moments of thinking about maybe something actually being shared more equitably, for good or for bad. If you want the old model back, I can imagine immediately ways to get it. And then also this kind of branding push. And I love what Todd had to say, the algorithmic warriors, or we can extend this to the sort of digital health warriors who, I'm in Berkeley, California, so I like to imagine they're through the wall in Silicon Valley, but also New York City.
I was just thinking about this idea of power. And I kids and child and adolescent work, a lot of the shift, there was a real shift in power there because the child could mute the therapist at will. Like there were all these sort of shifts in a dynamic there. I had one therapist who told me that, an old adolescent where he would like being summoned by someone in charge of him. And I found myself just really curious about all of that. I really agree with Jill's remarks and make a lot of sense to me, but I'm also curious how to think about happened in the power structures of psychotherapy, the way that parents were forced to be more centralized, and maybe that wasn't great when it was. It empowered parents to be more active in children's lives, and how do we kind of take the lessons or take the good from what happened and retain it is just a question that I have. And then one last thing about, I think we keep talking about the therapist who's forcing the patient to come back to the office, but I think there's also the opposite, which is that our patients may really want to come back, but they may be avoiding asking us to come back because of their sense that we do not want to come back, because we are wanting to do therapy from a place that's, on vacation and not at home, or not, not in the office, and, to really tune into to that potential as well.
I have, yeah, Todd. Oh, you're muted, Todd.
I want to share an observation that I think is going to be helpful to us in kind of framing this discussion that comes from these workshops that Julian Isaacs Russell and I have been teaching ever since March. We've probably connected with over 1,000 colleagues, which is that we're trying our best. I think clinicians are trying to make it work. And I think that attitude of how do we make this work? How do we write it? How do we creatively deal with all of these paradoxes and difficulties? How do we creatively deal with the losses that we're confronting so that we can actually help our people, help our patients, our clients? I think that we tend to underrepresent the goodwill and committed clinical creativity of our colleagues when we're talking about all of this. So I really want to emphasize that the kind of the both and approach that I'm talking about, the difficulties of negotiating all of these differences, the limitations that Jill so clearly outlined for kids, which is also present for adults in various ways, can become part of the relationship. Because what we're trying to do is basically do our best to be of help.
Absolutely, that's a great point. I have like a million other questions, but I do want to go to the Q&A because I know we're getting some questions in. So actually, can we start with Stephen Wrightboard, who is the editor of the PsiAN Forum. And Becca, if you could unmute him, great. Stephen had a question for the panel.
Hi, thanks. Some of the comments talking about advantages of teletherapy so far have been a kind of democratization. You know, the gold alloyed with the other thing. I don't know the quotation exactly. You know, there's a big price to pay, and I just wonder, you know, if that's if that argument is the one, of course, corporate entities are using, where you know, you get instant access, but you get it by text. You know, you get instant access. You can talk to your therapist, but they won't necessarily get the message until the next day. You know, that kind of thing. And I just wonder in general if we're trading that away too cheaply by accepting technical glitches, the faulty telepresence that Todd talks about, the lack of privacy. Certainly in this past year and a half, I've seen people on video who have all sorts of interruptions and so forth, both technical and interpersonal. And I'm thinking, isn't there some other way to democratize what we do where we don't have to give up so much to technology?
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course. But it would take, and people do it, right? There are free clinics and low fee clinics all around the country and the world for mental health care. And pre-pandemic, they were in person, certainly, right? It will take advocacy and activism that PsiAN is doing and others are doing to try and shift insurance standards and parity. Of course, there are other modes. Again, they have to scale. That's the advantage that, you know, corporate apps, for instance, offer. They claim to offer. Again, I don't believe that claim. So we would have to get really creative in the spirit of what Todd was speaking out about, creative and with goodwill. And that would really shift the field. Freud was not talking about technology, really. He was talking about a referral system that would allow folks to get treatment for free, not just in the consulting room. And it happened. I'll plug Elizabeth Danto's really beautiful book called Freud's Free Clinics as just a historical example of when that really works and scales beautifully.
And I want to jump on after that and draw for Stephen a real red line in between these corporate apps and what we're doing when we're doing teletherapies of depth, insight, and relationship. I think we have to clearly differentiate those as fundamentally different practices.
I was just going to very quickly say that I think another issue that comes up is that when we get too focused on whether we do or we don't do remote sessions, we sort of forget about the meaning that it holds within a treatment context. So for example, if I have someone that's supposed to come to my office, you know, post-pandemic, let's say I'm back in the office with them and they're supposed to come in for session. And then 1 minute after the session starts, I get a call that's like, I can't come in because I'm running late at work. Can we just do a remote session, right? How that and how I kind of think about my therapeutic boundaries and the meaning for this treatment is much more important, I think, than my position on whether I would be willing to do a remote session, right? Because there's other clinical issues coming up there that have to do with the work and the relationship. Argument is less about the democratization and I think more about thinking about what we're about the meanings, you know, underlying it. And that's just one example.
And going forward, I think there's going to be a lot of hybrid models where people are seeing some people via teletherapy, the same person via teletherapy and in person. And I've been really kind of struggling with this about how exactly to formulate it. But I think we're going to have to be really clear about how we set the different frames and how we set the different frames between working online and working in person. And kind of talking very clearly about set the frame for those transitions. So I think we have some kind of clinical technique issues that are kind of on the horizon for the next 6 months or so. And hopefully we're going to work our way through that well.
And I think it falls to us, particularly people like Leora, who's doing research on this, to make it clear to the world that these are clinical decisions. And I think it's a harder argument to make now. We've done it for 16 months. So if a patient does call and say, can we do this remotely? And we say, well, there are things to consider about this. We have to work harder, I think, to convince anyone that there are clinical issues and that it means something to ask for a remote session, to have a remote session, to be in remote as opposed to in the office. Whereas before the pandemic, that was an easy argument to make, and I made it all the time about what the difference was between working on the phone then or in person. But now that we've done it for a year, we who do insight in-depth relational work have to be very outspoken about the meaning of it and how to think about it as we go forward.
You know, something before I jump back to the Q&A, something this discussion is making me think of is, you know, before the pandemic, if a patient moved 6 hours away, even if they were in the same state in which I'm licensed, it would almost always lead to them going to new therapists because I primarily would work in person. And I'm just kind of wondering about this issue of proximity now and of conducting treatments that will only ever be online and how you guys are thinking about that and sort of what you'll be weighing as therapists when you make those sorts of decisions. And obviously this leads into this issues around SIPAC and national licensing. And I don't know how much time we'll have to get into that, but I am curious how you guys will sort of think about that issue of physical proximity.
Well, I was privileged to have a look at an advanced copy of Hannah's wonderful book. And she says that the opposite of presence isn't distance, it's absence. And I think that's really on target. That I think we are going to be seeing people in remote locations like that. The challenge is going to be the possibility of in-person work and a recognition that right now the MBAs, nothing against MBAs, they serve a very important function. The MBAs and the insurance companies are salivating at a national license because the future then will be usual and customary charges will be set by the lowest cost of living area in the country, and that if things can be done via teletherapy, then we're facing a future of therapist call centers in the middle of cornfields, where that's going to be the only treatment that's reimbursed. So we have to be really careful how we go about doing this. This is part of the nuance we need to kind of pay attention to, where the possibility of in-person work, this was absolutely crucial, I think.
I think I'm gonna, if I can, because we actually are getting quite a few questions in, I want to go back to the audience and make sure some people get a chance to ask. So we have Sherry Katz. Becca, if you could unmute Sherry, and Sherry, if you would share your question with the panel.
Sure. Oh, I'm on talk, not on Zoom. Okay. I'm so unaccustomed and I hate Zoom so much that I just, get
a hard time to hate Zoom.
Well, it's the right time to hate Zoom. I can your antithesis, example. Anyway, what I wrote in the chat was and I never left my office because room that's got 15-foot ceilings, 5 feet, and has a window open sounded safe to me, and I'm not dead, so I was fine with it. And what I found is since COVID started, let's see, prospective clients always ask me, are you doing Zoom or can we come in? And I see people in my office, and I think I grew my business by a lot because I was like the only game in town that was seeing people in office, which doesn't say anything about my skills with them. But anyway, so that's my background. What my question is to you is like, what weight do you give, what I wrote was, what weight do you give the patient's opinion on their choice of Zoom or in-office therapy? Or since you're analysts, do you all make the decision for them? Because I don't know how that works. I mean, as a couples and families therapist, it's much more interactive than I think my understanding of what analysts do. So like, what role does, their opinion have?
Great, thank you, Sherry. So the question is, what weight are we placing on our patients' preferences, opinions about how they want to meet?
It's got to be a collaboration. Analysts, as someone who sees couples as well as does analysis, it's just as collaborative. It's just a different kind of collaboration. So one needs to kind of process it and work it through and recognize that what might be the immediate response is not ultimately what's most meaningful for the patient. So it needs to be explored and discussed and a joint decision made. That's just basic clinical technique, which needs to be maintained whether one is doing teletherapy, teleanalysis, in-person therapy, in-person analysis. The patient's important.
I just wanted to add what you just said, and this is maybe slightly off topic, but I think related, which is, I've been supervising students who are starting to learn how to do therapy during the pandemic, and I've been really stunned by the things that by the things that are going on, like patients driving during sessions or someone else being in the room during the whole session. And so of course we're so collaborative with our patients, but I think actually this has been a moment where the moment has required such flexibility, and especially for people who don't yet have a really kind of ingrained understanding of the frame. It's like the frame's there so that you can deviate from it, but if you never learned the frame in the first place, or you learned it on a screen, it's actually quite difficult to think about how to now negotiate with your patients to yet to understand and learn. And so that's been a challenge, conundrum that I've been thinking a lot about.
Yeah, we have another question from the audience here from Dana Chariton. Dana, are you there?
Hi, yes,
Hi.
I am here. You actually, Bevin, you touched on what my question was, and now I have to find it in the chat. But so yes, I said, but my question is actually a very old question, but it's in a new post-ish pandemic context. And as things begin to open back up and in-person therapy becomes possible again, like I'm sure many of us have had patients that have dispersed to various geographic locations. So I guess what I'm wondering is, has the pandemic changed any of your opinions about this sort of longstanding question of whether or not the attachment is primary and you continue to engage in a distant treatment, or that the co-presence is what is more important and encourage a transition to a local therapist? And I don't think like any either or, it's black or white. I'm just more curious how the last 16 months, if the last 16 months have changed or altered any of your thinking about it.
Thank you, Dana. Anyone want to tackle that one?
I mean, I don't want to take more than my share here, so I have a response, but for
Yeah,
me,
please.
the pandemic has significantly deepened my appreciation of human fragility and loss. And how that translates into this question of the pros and cons of whether to transfer or not transfer is mostly just to kind of significantly deepen the humility with which I approach what a patient is talking about with that. And I think I am hopefully more collaborative in figuring that out now than I would have been 2 years ago.
I mean, this question also does make me, and I want to hear other people's thoughts, but it does make me think of this, sort of rallying cry we're hearing now about the need for national licensing. And Todd, you have been one of the, the voices of dissent and sort of suggested that the, as you say, algorithm warriors might really like national licensing. But I think, on the other hand, it really does bring up this question of, under what circumstances can we stay attached, and how do we think about that? Leora?
Yeah, I guess I just my desire is for us to just be kind of really looking at our own defenses and examining ourselves, because I just think there's so many motivations that can lead us to want one thing or the other. I mean, that's always the case, but I think particularly now, right, it's much easier to say, well, let's just keep working together because you're moving to California, or it's easier to say, oh, I don't believe in that. I believe in being in person, so I'm not going to keep working with you. But in fact, what we've learned is that both are feasible options, and I think as long as we can really spend the time in analytic curiosity with our patients, and with some of my patients who've said, like, I think I'd rather stay remote, I've sometimes said things like, well, what if we tried an in-person session and saw what it was like, and felt that together, and like, just give ourselves space to think about what was lost, if anything, right, for those who say that it's the same, and just trying to push it a little bit, for everybody's sake, so that we learn what's really happening underneath.
Well, I'm feeling very aware of the loss of time, which has gone very quickly, and wishing that we had a lot more time to talk about this. And it's obviously something that there is a lot to say about. I just want to express so much appreciation to this panel for coming and for your remarks. They're really thought-provoking. And I want to thank everyone for attending. So this event will be again on the PsiAN Forum, so you can view it, and it'll be hosted there. And if you are not familiar with PsiAN, or this is your first exposure to us, please come check us out at PSIAN.org. And again, I just want to thank all the panelists so much for coming. This was a really amazing event. So thank you all so much, and have a wonderful evening.